Right. Thank you, everyone, for coming, especially on a Friday afternoon. I know you probably have better things to do. And someone asked me, a friend of mine asked me a few days ago, Terence, did you deliberately choose today to have a talk about ghosts? And I was like, no, why? So you know what day it is? It's like, oh crap. Okay, yeah. So we were joking that that's why the first row is empty today in the talk. So hi. Thanks for coming as well. Questions? I'll throw the Huawei later. See whether or not you have anything to ask of me. I initially had the cover photograph for my presentation as some kind of arty-farty picture of the palanquins and or the kyo from the Nine Emperor Gods, kind of show the textures and the flows of sacred spaces in Chinese religion. And then Facebook, being Facebook, remembering more things better than ourselves, sent this photograph or one of the photographs to me, telling me 8 years ago you took this picture. And then it occurred to me that, yeah, during the Hungry Ghost Festival in 2014, which is actually, I think, the first time I met Professor Dean face to face, which was at Jiulitong, right? Somewhere along Upper Thomson Road, where they were staging the Miu Lan Jiu Mu opera, which only happens every 10 years. So, and it was one of the events during this staging in which the entire opera troupe gathered outside of the temple and then started running along the road. And me being me, middle-aged, balding Chinese man with a camera, no one really stopped me running after them. But a couple of the younger men were stopped and saying, no, you can't. It's they're carrying something, it's dangerous spiritually for you. You stay here, don't follow them. It's good that I don't really speak Chinese very well, so I didn't understand why anyone was shouting at me, so I just ran along and took a few pictures. But what really struck me was that kind of ebb and flow, the way this group went out of the temple temporarily. They didn't rampantly run along the open street getting hit by cars. They followed all the proper rules. They ran down the sidewalk, they ran up the overhead bridge, they ran across the overhead bridge, down the overhead bridge and back again, all the while following traffic lights and things. And you're thinking, well, here we have an example of how embodied sacredness or the embodied spirituality of the opera troupe is carried out from the temple, along the road, up the overhead bridge, so Singaporean, right? Down the overhead bridge, and then across the traffic lights and back again, all while following health and safety regulations. So so I thought there's something to this when thinking about sacred space. So in this talk, I'm going to be trying to map out some of the arguments that I've made, in my most recent book of Gods, Gifts, and Ghosts. And this, thank you, pandemic. I've not had a chance to publicize this for 2 years. You could almost say this is the first time I'm actually seriously talking about the book for an hour. And the book's over there. I've asked for it to be passed around. You can see it's bigger than my head. It's specially designed like that, about 8 by 10 inches and about 150 color photographs. So it's an experiment in a different kind of format about what we think about sociology and geography monographs. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that at the end of this talk. So this talk is kind of 2 parts. One is that I'm going to talk about the theories and the concepts that I've come up with in this book. And the other one is actually going to talk about the book itself. So that's the shameless, the shameless strip. And of course, there's a discount code if you can find it later. So the key points today, we know that individuals and organizations have historically been regulated by both state and society when it comes to spatial religious practices in Singapore and other parts of the world. It is not a uniquely Singaporean thing. So if you read the work by Lily Kong, when she talks about official and unofficial sacred spaces, some of the challenges that minority, diasporic ethnic groups, migrant groups have around the world is their relationship with the state as well as with their host society. And you've seen various interactions, particularly geographers have looked at quite a fair bit, minority religious groups in the United Kingdom, Hindus trying to build funeral pyres in the North English countryside. They did try. Or Muslim graveyards in Glasgow. So it's not entirely unique to Singapore, but the conditions and the experiences tend to be quite similar. And usually when there is a kind of direct confrontation between the minority group and the, well, political or numerical minority and a more powerful entity in the form of state or majority society, that kind of direct confrontation usually fails with on the side of the minority group. So how do minority groups continue to perpetuate themselves in the spaces they inhabit without taking on this kind of direct confrontation? How do they survive? How do they perpetuate themselves? How do they sustain themselves? In other words, how do they create a kind of subtle and creative resistance to majority rules or regulations? And the so-called research question of the presentation is, how do we theorize and visualize such resistance in the context of sacred space and spiritual capital? So I have two interconnected propositions today. One is that I have come up with a not completely original term, but slightly original, called sacred flowscapes. And two, about how do we visualize it. I'm going to talk a little bit about how photography and a visual monograph works in the context of investigating fluid, changing sacred spaces that ebb and flow physically through infrastructure. I should also add a caveat here that colloquially, I am known as a kind of jia kantang kind of person, you know, the potato eater, and my Mandarin pronunciation is terrible. So if I say a name or a term or something in Hokkien or Chinese wrongly, and you're like, oh, Terence, come on, I'm really sorry. Sorry, Prof. D. Yeah, so that's my caveat, and yeah, that's my disclaimer. So again, if I get anything wrong, sorry about that. So where do we begin? For the benefit of the audiences online or here who are not super familiar with Chinese religion, you know, with the term Chinese religion, I'm just going to go through it really, really quickly. Again, if you've been doing this as well on your side, you know, you can take a nap for the next 2 or 3 minutes. We know that Chinese religion, or at least the term, is an academic term. And personally, I always say this when I write a paper or a book or do a presentation, is that I actually don't quite like the term Chinese religion, because you know, you go around in Singapore and you don't have anyone who says, I'm a Chinese religionist. Just like Christians don't go around saying, I'm a Western religionist. The term itself is used to refer to blended religious forms practiced by Chinese individuals or groups. So that would, in Singapore, that usually refers to a mix of Taoism, Buddhism, and folk beliefs. Sometimes it's also called Chinese popular religion. That's Qi Bing Tan talked a little bit about that in a recent book that he wrote. But he also made reference to Zhengyi Taoism. So it's a kind of a Taoist folklore combined with certain kind of Taoist beliefs. And that's pretty much accurate, because as you can see, many of the individuals and groups that I have studied as part of my fieldwork are also registered with the Singapore Taoist Federation. So there is that kind of umbrella organization which refers to them. But for the purposes of this talk and the book, and that's where, you know, I spent about, I don't know, 300 words complaining about the term. When I say Chinese religion, I generally mean the things that, like Chinese popular religion and folk religion, that is practiced in Singapore. We know that as compared to about 50 to 60 years ago, the number of individuals who profess and practice this particular kind of religion are falling in numbers, even by their own admission. I remember about 7 or 8 years ago, oh, that's a long time, I was at the Hogang Dongwukong celebrations on Pulau Pongo Timor. That is the, you know, where they had this giant procession with Lamborghinis and floats, and I was really impressed. I thought, wow, that's a big ship they're going to set on fire. But one of the MCs said, yeah, it's not as big as it used to be. And I was like, oh, it's really pretty big. But yeah, it is beginning to fall in popularity, and we can see that it's also becoming more stratified in terms of things like class and other, you know, sociological markers, where you would see Chinese religion being practiced across a wider demographic in Singapore. We are now beginning to see it, you know, being a bit more popular with the working class Chinese Singaporeans, as opposed to the upper middle classes, who, you know, there's a mix of atheism, Christianity, mainstream Christianity, popular Christianity, etc., etc. We also have to remember that there's a whole lot of people in Singapore who profess to be free thinkers, i.e. atheists, who also practice Chinese religion rituals, right? They say, I don't believe in any spirits. Oh, by the way, don't say anything during Hungry Ghost Festival, okay? Don't step on that. No. My first encounter with the Hungry Ghost Festival was when I was in the army, and people are telling me, oh, Terence, shouldn't you be going home soon? I'm like, why? The ghosts are coming. Huh? What? Really? Oh. That's probably a signal of privilege as well, I suppose. But yeah, it's many of the practices that we see are also cultural, or seen as cultural, or as part of everyday life, singing, Hungry Ghosts, etc., etc. In relation to this, we can also think of the Singapore state and rules. Now, and any of you who've done Singapore studies will know that the state plays a significant role in the lives of Singaporeans. And I could probably do another 2 or 3 hour, I could do a whole module talking about the role of state policy in the lives of Singaporeans, but that's not the focus of today's talk. The policies we know that the policies are enacted and enforced around many things. Ethnic identity. Any of you born in the 70s or 80s will notice how your dialect names changed to Han Yu Pinyin magically, or at least you've kind of double-barreled it or something like that. I'm a product of the two-child policy. My mother was actually heavily involved in it with the Ministry of Health. So there's a lot of things that the state does. But for the purposes of this presentation, I'm going to think about what it means for land use. In other words, how does the state regulate the use of space for religious and or spiritual activities? And I really like that photo, which I took probably about 5 years ago. And as you can see, it is during Hungry Ghost Festival. It's got all the temporary altars set up, but just above the sign that says no littering, no motorbikes, and no having fun whatsoever. No football, no kickball, no roller skating. Standard, typical void deck, right? But certainly a really good example. I wouldn't be surprised if eventually in a few years you start seeing more no signs being added onto the 4 that are at the top. So that's that kind of strict regulation. In terms of sacred space, we know that religious buildings in Singapore are, again, can only be set up explicitly in terms of outward-facing religious buildings. It can only be set up explicitly with planning permission from the state. You can't just buy a piece of land and put up a mosque, temple, church, whatever. It's just not allowed. It has to be specific parcels of land for religious use. Sometimes they are, well, the new ones are now won by intra-religious bids. So I think some of you may remember from about, was it 5 or 6 years ago, where a private company won a land bid to build a columbarium and a temple, and then they found out it wasn't an actual religious group but a private company, and people got really upset about that. So that kind of bleeding in of neoliberalism into religious practices and state policy of these kinds of intersections. You also know that every time a new town cluster has been set up in Singapore, there are also limited spaces for so-called official sacred spaces. In other words, if you don't have the money to bid or to tender for an auction piece of land, any of you who live in Sengkang, Punggol, you will sometimes see combined temples. It looks like one temple, but actually 3. That's so Singaporean, right? The hub of temples. If you don't have the money to join up with your friends and bid for this, where else do you go? Most people will either maybe try their homes or increasingly use factory spaces, because now it's become legal since about 2014 to convert a flatted factory into some kind of religious space, because the state, while being regulatory, also recognizes the need for religious groups to practice their faith in one way or another. But that's it and done. Individuals often have to find creative ways to subvert, and by subvert, I don't mean break regulations, but simply to operate in the sphere of the restrictions and boundaries in which they found themselves. And I propose that that's often done in Singapore by using something called the spiritual imagination. And we always say that Singaporeans are very imaginative. Thanks to censorship in the 1980s, they say everyone from the 1980s is very imaginative because everything gets cut in Singapore, right? Watch a film, oh, that's censored. Never mind, I'll just fill it in with my imagination. But now the spiritual imagination, I've drawn that idea from Edward Sawyer's concepts of first, second, and third space. So first space being the space of planning, of maps, of structures. Second space being that of imagination, poetry, art, and third space being a combination of the two. And I've thought about the spiritual imagination because a lot of that, that is very much founded on the everyday and mundane practices of individuals and groups as they live and do the work, the religious labor or spiritual labor. And in the spiritual imagination, the dead, the divine, the demonic, they are all present and coherent. They are all what we would call agentic. Agentic individuals who have control and power over us, or who can influence the way that we behave. So I wrote an article in Social and Cultural Geography a few years ago about how the dead or spirits have agency and how that agency is transferred through material objects. So something which I call material proxies of consociation. Oh, such a complicated term. In the spiritual imagination, the world is simultaneously physical and spiritual. There are boundaries between physical and spiritual, but they are constantly in flux. They can be negotiated between individuals and within the imagination. So this was my way of trying to understand that sacredness or sacred spaces are not static. They are malleable, they're fluid, they can move, but they can be shaped in real time. And in this kind of world, the spirits and humans coexist. We often think about the Hungry Ghost Festival as the peak point in the calendar year where spirits and humans interact. But if you practice Chinese religion, you will know that that actually goes on for the whole year. It just so happens that it's really obvious this time of the year, thanks to stuff that's burning, lots of stuff that's burning, lots of smoke, random things you don't want to step on, etc., etc. So physical and spiritual places then overlap according to how individuals construct and narrate them through their practices. What are these kinds of characteristics? Well, as a sociologist, I like to think of it as compared to the sociological imagination. Now, if you go back to your Soci 101, I know it's a bit traumatic for some of you maybe, but in Soci 101, the first thing we teach sociology students is what is the sociological imagination, which is the sociological imagination is basically the ability to see the social in personal problems. So if someone can't find a job, we don't just think about the inability to find a job, we think about issues related to class, gender, etc., wider social problems. In the same way, the spiritual imagination is a way of seeing the sacred in the mundane and the spiritual in the everyday. And the world and one's immediate surroundings, whether here, on the roadside, at home, anywhere, it's not just about these kinds of physical objects, but about the potential for us to engage and interact with spirits at the same time. That means there is some kind of overlap. The boundaries between what is alive, what is dead, what is physical, what is ephemeral, what is fluid, malleable, are all up for negotiation. And then the question then arises, how does that negotiation happen? How do these spaces ebb and flow? And what makes it such that they can successfully define something that is on a day-to-day basis very mundane? Example, a void deck. How does that then become something sacred or spiritual over a temporary period of time? So I like the spiritual imagination. It's not just people sitting down thinking, yeah, the ghost is over there in the corner, yeah. No, there really are other things that need to happen. There are other kinds of social processes that are going on that develop sacredness. And that happens in two ways. One is that we can think of the embodied sacred practices of Danki. And two, we can think of how sacred spaces tend to be liminal in the way they ebb and flow from and within particular other kinds of spaces, slightly more permanent structures. So this was taken before lockdown. Yeah, I think so. Yeah, just before lockdown, 2019. It was kind of a revisit to the area which I photographed when I wrote my seminal 2015 paper. A bit of a one-hit wonder in sociology. That was a good paper, but probably the best thing I've written. But it was a study of Teiki Court, and I just walked around Ang Mo Kio a bit more to photograph people doing their thing, obviously following ethical guidelines, more interested in spaces, hiding faces, etc., etc. You can see on the left-hand side a much more permanent structure to Tua Pek Kong. And on the left side, sorry, that's the left side, and on the right-hand side, you can see, despite the fact that there are already altars, people are still setting up other kinds of altars temporarily behind shops, just by the road. And why is that? Because during this period of time, the spiritual imagination is activated significantly in the belief that the spirits are here to engage with us, or at least to engage with the things that we set out for them. You will also realize that many of these altars leave traces, or what some people call ethnographic traces, on the walls, bird marks, little pieces of paper, bai ku qian flying here and there. Sometimes if you're not careful, just fly straight to your face as you're walking along, that kind of thing. Or candles and joss sticks, just wailing. So if you think about it as well, there's a kind of feel or aesthetic or atmosphere that takes shape with the use of material artifacts, with the use of embodied practices. This kind of embodied practices also gives rise not just during the Hungry Ghost Festival, but with spirit mediums. Now, again, for the benefit of those tuning in online who are not familiar with Chinese spirit mediums, in Singapore, spirit mediums or Dangqi or Luantong are individuals who go into trances and are said to be possessed by the spirits of deities. And these deities are often drawn from a mix of Taoist, Buddhist, and folk religion pantheons. You will find, references to Guan Yin, to Qi Tian Da Sheng, to I have seen a whole variety of deities and gods, and even in Singapore specifically, you will find hybridizations that are not necessarily unique, but quite special and interesting. A couple of examples. One is that if you look hard enough, somewhere in the north of Singapore, there is a spirit altar in which the spirit mediums are trancing Hindu deities, and they wear saris, and they, and they actually, the followers wear saris, and it's actually an active and persistent hybridization of ethnic forms or cultural forms into new religious forms. I am told somewhere near Pekyo Market, there's someone claiming to trance Jesus. Quite interesting as well. Yeah, I'd like to speak to that person actually. And just recently, a few years ago, I was talking to someone else to a particular Dangqi, and he said that one of his deities that he has a contract with is a Singaporean Tua. So a person an individual who died in 1960s from some kind of fight, and then was elevated to the status of Tua. And he lived a long book. And this whole story, this whole backstory, like an origin story from a Marvel movie, about how he became a god. And I was like, that's really interesting. That's really interesting to see how these cultural forms come in. You will know that Dangqi tend to operate in social housing flats and industrial areas in Singapore, particularly, often as part of a Sintua or a Sentang, that's a spirit altar. Increasingly, they are now also operating online through websites. So Alvin Lim, who's I think here at NUS, has also written quite a fair bit about Facebook and deities using Facebook to promote themselves, which I think is also fascinating and something I'd love to write about one day in the online sphere. So much of my research over those 4 years looks specifically at Sintua in unofficial sacred spaces. Now, these are spaces which the state does not, put for auction. You don't bid for a factory space to set up a temple. You rent a factory space and then you turn it into a so-called spirit altar. So these kinds of spaces are the epitome of what we would think as unofficial sacred spaces, is what geographers would call it. This is one example. You can't see this from the outside. So if you walk through the flatted factory, you wouldn't be able to see these practices because they are hidden behind a wall, behind some other kind of wall. But you have to go around the corner, you have to know where to look, and then you will find these giant altars. This was the first group of Dangqi, particularly the individual on the right-hand side, whom I first observed when I started my project on Dangqi. with donkey, you will find that there's a significant amount of resilience as long as they remain donkey. So in a paper I wrote in 2016, I wondered, how did these unofficial sacred spaces prove to be resilient? How is it that, they are quite precarious, right? Financially, structurally, etc., etc. If the donkey decides not to be a donkey anymore, the Sintua tends to close down or goes into hibernation until a new donkey can be found. So I kind of thought about it, and I realized that the reason why physical space is not as important to these organizations is because of the donkey themselves. And with the donkey, they have something which is a kind of embodied nature of practices. When they become a deity, when they go into a trance and become a deity, all the social attention moves away from the altar and towards them. And that kind of focus means that the body of the donkey becomes the locus upon which sacredness revolves. So sacred space is actually temporal and liminal and stops being as important when a donkey is in a trance. That kind of trance plus the dress, and you have seen donkey putting on the vestments of the deity that is possessing them. And that's really important, right? The vestments are key to people seeing the individual not as a human being, but as a deity for that period of time, is what Caroline Knowles might call comportment. Now that's kind of a theory from race and ethnic studies, but for me, comportment, the way one carries themselves, the way one makes use of aesthetic markers like dress or other kinds of things that donkey carry. Sometimes they carry a staff, sword, the weapons associated with their deity. This kind of comportment, this behavior of the donkey gives them authority and power over their followers. It makes them authentic. It gives them what one would call, what Werther would call spiritual capital. Spiritual capital being a drawing from Pierre Bourdieu's work on social cultural capital. Space at this point actually becomes less important than the actual body of the donkey. So a lot of my work has me spending 4 to 5 hours hiding in the corner of a Sintua, photographing donkey and their activities. And I'm always very interested in how they speak, how they move, how they interact with people, stuff like that. This was probably one of my most favorite scenes. It was a one room flat. So you can't see the background, but deep into the picture, there's actually just a simple cloth curtain that is separating the sleeping area from the rest of the flat. On the left-hand side, do you see kind of, it's not really an altar, it's just metal shelving, but that's their altar. So the individual, the group here, they're not the most well off. Some Sintua are very well off, some temples are very, very well off, but this was not a well off individual. So his version of the altar was just some metal shelving in which he put some deities there, some Kimsin there, and I found it really, really fascinating because you notice how the altar stops being important for a while, especially once the trance begins. This kind of comportment means they don't just become the social focus of their followers, but donkey are also, their role and their ability and their power and authority means they also arbitrate and determine what is sacred and what isn't, or what space is sacred and what space isn't sacred. They actively define these sacred boundaries. Particularly if any of you live in HDB estates, do you sometimes see tentages being set up? Basketball courts on the field and on the tent. If you've been around, or like me, spend too much time there, you will notice that the setup isn't as simple as build tent, people come, etc., etc. There are a whole bunch of rituals that are required to establish the tentage or that space as sacred. They'll put talismans on the side. There's a whole lot of things that go on. So, but who does all these things? Who establishes these boundaries? If there's a donkey there, it's usually there. You'll also notice that before most rituals where donkey are present, they do a little bit of an inspection round. They walk around, then you look at that, and they say, shift that 1 centimeter to the right. No, 1 centimeter to the left. Then it's always going like, and everyone is like, yes, no, yes, until they just get just right. It's okay, good. Then they go on. So this kind of authority stems from that kind of temporal spiritual capital that comes with being possessed. Notice that most Tangki, when they are not Tangki, are just normal human beings and do not claim authority any more than what they would. In Singapore, pragmatic as we are, most Tangki have day jobs, right? Some of them are actually full professionals working in industry, doing their thing, and on Saturdays they become gods, which I think also that's quite a Singaporean thing. But that kind of authority gives them sway over ritual and space. It allows for different levels of ritualized mobilities. I took this photograph during the Hungry Ghost Festival in 2016 or 17. And this was actually on a beach somewhere in the north of Singapore. But it was pitch black. So I had a tripod and I was able to do a long exposure. So what you're actually seeing, you wouldn't be able to see if you were standing there. And it was the Chao Tu festival ritual, which is like the Ulambana praying for lost souls, etc., etc. They have set up an altar behind where they are standing, and on the open beach space. When I was standing there photographing the ritual, I could see people just walking on the beach, on the shoreline, probably looking for crabs. Apparently, they weren't part of the group. However, when certain members of the group, particularly the musicians, walked down to the beach without asking the Tangki if they could go, they were immediately called back and scolded because the Tangki said, "You can't go down there, it's dangerous, you're going to get into trouble, you got to wait for me to bring you." There was a specific boundary between what was safe and what wasn't. And it was only when the Tangki said, "Fine, now we can all go together to the beach," we all walked down to the beach with, carrying lanterns and joss sticks, etc., etc. So it was a Tangki there who provided protection, but who also told us where and when we could stand or not. Didn't apply to the people looking for crabs, only applied to the people engaging inside the ritual. This is another one of my favorite ones. Really good example of how sometimes, again, it's like pragmatism. People make use of these spaces. Sintua and Tangki make use of these spaces in creative ways. Park bench, can sit down on it, no problems. No need throne, can sit on park bench. Is it a standard park? It's okay. We can put the generals of the 5 armies in particular spots to turn this into a space of protection. So it really is about adapting to regulation as well as to physical infrastructure. So you're probably fed up of hearing me talk for a while. I'm just going to play a 4-minute video just to give you an idea of how different Tangki affect space, engage in embodied practices, and how they celebrate the Hungry Ghost Festival. So you will notice that in that video, or at least in those pictures, how many of the Tangki did not stay in one place at any point in time. They were always moving out to the void decks, going on a procession, walking around, doing their UK, things like that. And that again goes into the ebb and flow, the idea that sacred spaces. Oh, sorry, I should just move that window. Sorry. Hide video. No, not better enough. Okay, you can, right? Yeah. I'll probably just restart the computer if I touch anything. You'll notice that sacred spaces in that case were liminal. They ebbed and flowed, maybe from a particular tentage or spot, but certainly they transgressed physical boundaries and then back again. So oftentimes, if you look at the geography of the literature on official and unofficial sacred spaces, you will find that there's a bit of a dichotomy. The space is either official or unofficial. And I think there's something to be said about the nuances and what's in between, based on the empirical evidence that I found. So thanks to the spiritual imagination, practitioners and adherents create temporal spaces with their own boundaries. I'm not saying that there are no boundaries, but these boundaries are flux that emanate and receive that ebb and flow from more fixed locations. And we can think of these as the temporary tents that we see in fields, informal processions, or even public rituals. And if you've ever participated in the 9 Emperor Gods Festival, you will occasionally see them at East Coast Park Beach, right? It's like, why there are 200 people carrying palanquins, and firing things into the air and setting things on fire. Everyone sets things on fire. Along waterfronts, where was it? I think it was a boat club as well. Yeah. So, but if you blink, you miss it. It goes on for about 2 hours and then it's gone, right? So, and that's very classic of the things that we see in Singapore. It's very fast, it's very temporal. And I've always said that that's one of the reasons why it is so resilient over the years, because it's not permanent, because it's transient. And those kinds of spaces are what I call sacred flowscapes. Flowscapes are how I define fluid, malleable sacred spaces that flow over, under, and through existing infrastructure and regulations. The term flowscape, any of you who are archaeologists or architects will know that that's not a novel term. Some other people have used it about 10 years ago in archaeology to describe river flows, in architecture to, again, I think it's about, sorry, I'm not good at that part, but yeah, the word flowscape is not new, but the sacred flowscapes are what I'm thinking about. And these flowscapes, they work because they don't seek direct confrontation. Like water, they move with political, legal, or regulatory structures. And it's not, again, I would say that even though my case study is based on Tangki practices and embodied sacredness and liminal sacred spaces in Singapore, we see these kinds of sacred flowscapes around the world practiced by other religions when they are unable to establish permanent positions. Yeah, and not just Chinese religion. So other literature has shown how minorities fail when they confront, but then they find ways around it, whether that's through temporary processions or whether that is by having other kind of temporary or non-permanent sacred structures, whether that's at bus stations or along the road or stuff like that. And going back to that photograph of people running down Upper Thomson Road, flow exists through the spiritual imagination. It doesn't work if you don't believe that that space can be spiritual. So if you think that, say, only, for example, the altar in a temple or a church is sacred and everything else outside of that is not sacred, then this concept doesn't work. It requires an imagination and a belief that the spiritual is or can be anywhere. And that's the final part of the concept, which is what we call strategic conformity. Now, colloquially in Singapore, we know one of the rules is do anything, don't get caught. I'm joking. But it's the, yes on one hand, and then I just do whatever, kind of attitude, right? So strategic conformity is the formal term that I've come up with to think about, you don't break the rules, but you just find a way to work with it. And that is where flow comes in. Oftentimes, many of these Sintua and Tangki would also, and I don't really have time to talk about this particular thing, but they do appropriate state discourse, where they practice their faith creatively within the regulatory landscape, whether that is making use of things like, of words like heritage, or history, or identity. It then becomes not just something about religion or faith, but also becomes something about being Singaporean and having a Singaporean identity. So this ties in with other sociological work, particularly Paul Gilroy's idea of the changing same, and how diasporic communities perpetuate ethnic identities across national geographical boundaries, but also engage in a kind of change. It's same, but it's changing. Same, but different. And if there are these kinds of flowscapes, how then do we visualize them meaningfully? So this is the last part of the talk in which I think about visual methods. And I think about the methodology of visualizing liminal and transient and sometimes imaginary spaces. We know that photography is a well-accepted genre in the social sciences, particularly in anthropology and geography, but it's rarely called upon, strangely enough, when it comes to the sociological or geographical study of Chinese religion. Many social science approaches to Chinese religion, or other religions for that matter, if you read the literature widely enough on sacred spaces, tend to treat photographs as evidentiary material, or what I like to call proof of life photographs. So if you hand the camera to a social researcher and tell them, go visualize religion, most of the time it'll be, ooh, altar, oh, donkey, or, it's just take what you see as proof that the thing existed. There isn't really an attempt to move beyond a kind of realist level depiction of religion or as evidentiary material. We need to think about how we can go further beyond that kind of realistic depictions. And again, I could spend about 2 hours talking about this. In fact, I teach an undergraduate module where I do 12 weeks of beating this into my students. So this is a really condensed version of it. I often ask myself, how do we photograph religion meaningfully so that the photographs do more than just the text that is used to describe the photographs? There are challenges and opportunities, but I think, and there's always the temptation to move first for evidence. And I would say, yeah, that's true. I've been photographing Bukit Brown Cemetery, the Hungry Ghost Festival, Tangki practices, and I've been doing this for about 10 years. Yeah, oh gosh, it's the 10th year that I'm doing this. And when I first start shooting, I always think about, shooting the evidence first. I went there, I saw this is what it looked like, and then I rely on an ethnographic narrative to make a thick description. But to make visual outputs meaningful, I say that the photographs need to do more. You need to demonstrate and symbolize things that text cannot do. Sometimes this might even undermine your own textual arguments, but photographs can be effectual. They can have effective power. They can, as Gillian Rose said, they can demonstrate emotions that go beyond realistic descriptions. And it begins with photographic grammar. So this is another shameless plug of my first book, Visual Methods in the Field. If you're ever curious about how to start off as a photographer in sociology, geography, etc., and you want to learn photography from the perspective of a social researcher, that's the book to buy. The main concept of that book is something I call photographic grammar, which I shamelessly stole some concepts from Roland Barthes. Where the question was, if you can't quote punctum, the thing that pricks the emotions into a photograph, because punctum is deeply personal, how then do you quote studio? How do you invite someone to study a photograph, to think about it symbolically? How do you inform, surprise, or signify within a picture? It's all fine and great to say that a photograph needs to be able to inform, signify, or surprise, but as a researcher, as someone who creates their pictures, and I think a lot of visual researchers in the social sciences often don't make their own pictures. They rely on other photographers or they draw from archives. One of my missions in my career is to actually try to bring these two together to create an interdisciplinary practice of sociology and photography together. So what we choose to frame in our lens, how we take the photograph, all leads to a compelling image. And I think from my perspective, because I was a wedding photographer for a number of years before I became a sociologist, that's what the third book's about, actually, Chinese weddings in Singapore. I'll plug that later. Was the beginning of that. And that happens by photographing what I call points of praxis. points of praxis, meaning the kind of like what Henry Cartier-Bresson talked about, the decisive moment. It is about finding the decisive moment in the practice of religion and the embodiment of sacredness that we can find that happen in how bodies and objects move together or against each other. It is about objects in motion. It is about objects that perform. It is about people performing with objects. And by photographing people at these specific points, we are then able to capture the presence of absence. Like, think about absence-presence dichotomy that Avril Madrell writes about when she writes about deathscapes, or to freeze peak moments of the spiritual imagination, which means, it usually means that the camera is the main fulcrum between you and your subject. I think a lot of researchers have a tendency to take about 4 pictures when they go out into the field. On average, whenever I'm out doing a study, it's about 600 to 800 photographs. It's a bit excessive, I know. And my computer is begging for help. You know, it's like, I can't, it's too much. So I've got to find a graph for more hard drive space. This is the second video. I have about 10 minutes left. Yeah, so I think I have enough time. This is the second video about the 9 emperor gods. And this particular series of pictures is what I'm trying to get at. This kind of photographing the peak points of belief and spirituality when people do things. I think there's a little bit of a warning about sudden noises, but yeah, it should work. Sorry, I need a bit of help to turn off the, I think it keeps coming up. But what do we do with these photographs once we actually create them? I think, again, this is one of the things that's we are living in quite exciting times now over the last 10 or 15 years, because photographs and other kinds of non-traditional research outputs are becoming a bit more acceptable, largely thanks to e-publishing and the fact that we don't really look at paper copies of journals anymore, but we now, even books we tend to download as PDFs or as, or with embedded media inside them. That's it and done. There are still conservative social scientists who frown upon visual methods because they say it's not a real method. And I've encountered this more than once in my career with some trauma associated with that. If you read in some journals, some sociologists have pointed out that photographs have historically been rejected by sociologists for lack of objectivity in the 1950s or 60s. And of course, many of these outputs are still considered quite difficult to judge in research or national research frameworks like the REF, again, much to my chagrin. But things are changing slowly but surely. We are starting to see journals having specific sections for creative work. At the most recent 2021 REF in the United Kingdom, there was actually some comments about the need for more creative outputs being submitted for assessment. So I think there is space to develop visual-centric outputs in academic journals and publications that do things that just text alone would not do. How do we make them? How do we create these kinds of outputs? Oh no, not that guy again. It begins with something called a visual essay. So very briefly, the visual essay or the visual social science essay has been conceived by a number of people, me included, over the last few years to think about what does a photo essay or visual essay look like, but it is not just photos, but it's also academic as well. A number of journals, I would recommend looking at visual studies, cultural geographies, sociological research online, have been doing this for about 10 or 15 years, some of them, especially cultural geographies. And it comprises about 1,000 to 2,000 words and 10 to 15 images, not always photographs, but often photographs. And these visual essays differ from a practice photo essay because of that 1,000 to 2,000 words. There's a use of theoretical frameworks, there's a research question that people are trying to answer, and the investigation is couched in social research or social science traditions. Of course, if you think about it, while we are able to depict, visually depict something that is important, and we're able to make some kind of argument, 1,000 to 2,000 words still means it's difficult to conceptualize something and argue it out sufficiently. So this was one of the things that I struggled with very much as a photographer and as a sociologist. How do I bring the two together into something that is substantial and something that can be, where I can make particular arguments like I just did about sacred flowscapes. I think it'll be very difficult to do a full argument about flowscapes with just one visual essay. So if you can't do one, then I did 10. And that's where the book that you've just seen emerged. A visual monograph, again, that term's not new. Anthropologists use it as a way to depict ethnographic film. And photography academics use it to define photo books. But again, the difference between this and the photo book is that the photo book makes minimal use of text. This makes substantial use of text. That for me, there's a 6,000 word introductory chapter and a 6,000 word end chapter in which I really try to bookend some of the theoretical arguments that I've been making. It's a long form version of the visual essay. For me, it was a collection of visual essays, but which put the photograph or the image as the primary mode of communication. And the product that you see here today has been me losing most of my hair over the last 4 or 5 years trying to come up with, and people have asked me, are you going to do it again? I say, hell no. But then we always say that, right? 3 years later, we do another one. But no more hair left to lose, so it's okay. Yeah. Anyway, that's all I have to say. Thank you very much for the time.